Hey everyone, welcome to Geeking Out, the podcast in which we dive into the career journeys of some of the amazing humans in tech and geek out on topics like software development, DevOps, observability, reliability, and everything in between. I'm your host, Adriana Villela, coming to you from Toronto, Canada. Geeking out with me today, I have Jean-Mark Wright. Welcome, Jean-Mark.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Lovely to have you. And where are you calling from today?
So today I'm calling from Toronto, Canada.
Right on, fellow Torontonian. And I'm
Yeah.
gonna say we met in person. I definitely remember we met in person at least once.
Yeah.
But before that, did we originally meet online, like
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
LinkedIn?
I think we exchanged a couple conversations and had a little bit of a debate on LinkedIn.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you always you responded to a number of my LinkedIn posts, and then you've always asked like
Right.
really thoughtful questions, like DM me on LinkedIn. And I remember one of your questions even led me to like I started like writing it out in LinkedIn Messenger, and I'm like, I feel like this is a blog post.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly it.
It's always so exciting to like have the folks that I interact with on LinkedIn. First of all, get to meet in person, and then
Yeah.
secondly, have on the podcast. So I'm super excited to have you on here. And to get started, I've got some icebreaker questions. Are you a lefty or a righty?
I'm a lefty.
All right, team lefty, awesome. I get so excited with other lefties. I swear,
Oh,
anyone who's
you're a
like
lefty
watched
as
the
well?
show, I'm a lefty as well. Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Every single time, like I have a lefty, and if people have like listened to this podcast from the beginning, no matter what, when a lefty comes on, I'm like, yay! I found my
Yeah.
people. It's always so fun. Are you like because I am definitely dominantly lefty, but I do a few things right-handed. Like I turns out like for archery, I do it the right-handed way, and I
Mhm.
mouse with my right hand. How about you? Are you
Yeah, my wife keeps telling me I should never tell anybody I'm left-handed because the only thing
ah,
I do is write with my left hand. Like everything else is is the right
that
hand,
is
but it's
so
okay.
funny.
I claim it. I claim it. I love being left-handed. I tell people I'm left-handed. It's fine.
That's awesome. Yes, that's right. You got to lean into the leftiness.
Yep.
Amazing. Okay, next question. Do you prefer iPhone or Android?
Oh, definitely Android. I'm sorry. I can't do iPhone.
I don't know if we can be friends anymore.
Yeah,
I'm
I
just
like my
kidding.
freedom. I like my freedom. I like being able to make decisions on my own. Make choices. I also don't like being a part of a cult.
Yeah, no, it's true. I am part of the Apple cult. Proud member. That's awesome. I love that. So have you been like an Android user from the beginning, like when the first Android came out?
uh, yeah, pretty. I mean, this actually takes me back because I remember I used to be like started on like Sony Ericsson. I remember Sony Ericsson when like they hadn't
Oh
like
my God,
standardized
yes.
like this is like pre Android,
Yeah,
pre
yeah.
Android because I remember there was like Sony Ericsson and then I had a Nokia and there was the whole Symbian operating system. Um,
Yes.
and that was like a huge thing. Like Nokia had like this dominance, and then like Nokia just never. I don't remember if it was iOS or Android that came up, but yeah, eventually I switched to Android.
Nice, nice. It brings back memories of talking about like the Nokia. It's so funny because like, you know, I remember in those days everyone had a Nokia. I never
Yeah.
owned a Nokia.
Oh, you've
I
never,
owned
never?
no,
Wow, never.
never,
Wow.
never. Never jumped onto the Nokia bandwagon. I had a couple of LG phones. I had
Mm.
3 LG phones, 2 flip phones, and then one which was the LG Chocolate, which was like my favorite dumb
Oh
phone
yeah, I
ever
remember the chocolate.
because it was
Yeah.
a slider and it looked like a little chocolate bar. It was like the most beautiful little phone. I think that was like my favorite phone, and I that was That was my last phone before I got my first smartphone, which was a BlackBerry Curve.
Yeah. I mean, do you remember the infamous Nokia 3310?
Vaguely,
Oh boy. That was
vaguely.
like that was like the
Now I
phone
have
that
to
like
Google it.
everybody talked about playing
Oh,
Snake
then
on. And
okay, I'm gonna Google
the
this
other
now.
thing,
Nokia
the other thing
3310.
about that phone, it was allegedly indestructible. Like you couldn't drop
Yeah.
test, it would pass like every drop test. Like yeah.
I mean, every person that I knew who had a Nokia loved it, and I don't know
Yeah.
why I never got around to it. I don't know if it's maybe because like my phone carrier didn't carry it because I don't know if you remember in the before times, like in Canada, where like certain carriers carried certain brands of phones, and then like, and this was before you could easily switch
Mm.
carriers, before you could even port your phone number, so like you were kind of stuck with the same
Right.
carrier unless
Yeah.
you wanted to like switch to a new phone, or like you were willing to part with your phone number. And it's funny because I saw a meme the other day referring to that Nokia model, and I'll post the link in
Hmm.
the show notes for those who want to feel nostalgic, where it was like a picture of the Nokia with a phone case, and it was like
Right.
making fun of the fact like, why do you need a phone case for the phone that's
Exactly.
like
You
so
don't.
indestructible?
Yeah. You don't.
Which is hilarious because I remember I had phone cases for my old phones as well, and those things were way more indestructible than the smartphones of today, where I've got a nice little plastic case for my phone and a screen protector, and
Yeah. Screen
because
protector.
phones get fly out of my hand. So
Yeah, those
yeah,
those phones like back then they really made stuff like
yeah,
really
yeah.
really that was really well built.
Yeah, totally. Well, even, even the BlackBerry was a great phone, and
Yes,
one of the
yes,
reasons why I
yes.
switched, though, is because my Curve started switching off, like, turning itself off in the middle of phone calls spontaneously, and I'm like, "Screw this, man. I don't want I'm getting an iPhone."
Yeah, yeah. I was
Yeah.
on the BlackBerry backwagon for a little bit too.
But it was a
Good time.
great phone. I love typing on the BlackBerry. I still like,
Yeah,
the typing
that's
mistakes I make on my phone now. I'm just like, BlackBerry, I wouldn't have made those mistakes.
yeah, and I mean I think that's something I miss from the tactile era. Because I remember having, phones and like the QWERTY keyboard, like, well, sorry, pre-QWERTY keyboard when it was just the numbers and
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
touch typing. That's what it was called, touch
Yeah, yeah,
typing.
yeah, yeah.
Like
That's
I,
right.
I
That's right.
remember I used to be able to put my hand in my pocket and like I could actually type like a full sentence, full paragraph, and just like hit send without ever looking at the phone because that's
Damn.
just the difference with tactile, right? Like you that
Yeah.
kind of feedback that you get, like you just don't get that from screens, and like I feel that's one thing that we've lost that we just haven't regained because that kind of accuracy, like I think that's just gone forever.
Oh, I know. But that is a next level talent to be able to type in a message in your pocket like that. That's amazing. I found those the numeric keypad keyboards so irritating for typing texts. And I remember like I reserved texts for very special occasions because also, remember when it would cost you like so much money to send a text, or if you like opened your web browser by accident and you're like, no, I'm
Yeah.
gonna get charged a fortune now.
Back to the days of GPRS and all these
Yes.
things.
Exactly, exactly. Are you using CDMA or TDMA?
Yeah,
These things of long, long ago that kids these days will never appreciate.
never appreciate. It's funny because like one thing I was saying is like my kids are never gonna appreciate this because like growing up, I used to get in trouble running up the phone bill because you'd actually call and you get charged per minute,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah,
like I
yeah.
get in trouble for how long I'd be talking on the phone, but no, you have WhatsApp and you have all these different apps that you just call. Like it's not per you
Exactly.
have a flat rate and it's like they would know you're on the video call. You could be on a video call for hours, and like because
I
it's basically a
know.
flat rate. It's like yeah,
It's
good
wild.
times.
Yeah. I remember like I had a special evening and weekends plan. So like I had a
Yes.
boyfriend in university who lived in Mississauga, which for people who are from outside Toronto, I lived in a suburb called Markham. He lived in a suburb called Mississauga, and it was long distance calls between
Mm,
Markham and Mississauga, even though we were like in the Toronto area.
yeah.
And I remember, well, first of all, we both had Toronto numbers, 416 numbers, instead of like the
Right.
905 numbers, so it wasn't long distance. But in order to call each other in the evening, we would call each other on our cell phones, um, but in the evening because it was free.
Yeah, we had similar plans like that in Jamaica. Definitely remember those days too.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely blast from the past. Okay, next question. Do you prefer Mac, Linux, or Windows?
Definitely Mac. I used to be heavy on Linux. Actually, so maybe about 2, 3 jobs ago, I remember
Mhm.
like I spent. I hope my boss from back then isn't watching this. Like I spent too much time, like just trying to configure Linux. Like I don't know if you remember. There's this back then there was this OS and it had this flashy GUI called Burial. So it was
Ooh,
just like really
I remember that one.
animated. So if you clicked, I don't mean like it, this just looks normal now with Mac, but like if you clicked minimize, like the window would just kind of like dance, not like go down. Yeah, like every time it was crazy back then because every time I updated the OS, like I'd have to spend like almost a day trying to get the GUI working. Like
Oh
I
my
just
god.
get dropped back to the terminal and I'm like, some driver is not working. I'm like, oh god, like God, yeah.
I
And this is
relate to that so
pre
hard.
Chat GPT days when I could just say, hey, like this is the error. Give me a series of steps I can try. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And then if if your network was down, but you're trying to troubleshoot your network card, you're screwed. And I can't tell you the number of times I had issues with my network interface. Yeah, I mean, I'm the same as you. Like I loved playing around with Linux, but my
mm,
god, trying to get
yeah.
things to
It
work
was
in Linux was like, why?
yeah. Back
Yeah.
then it was a pain. It's thankfully it's gotten a lot better, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I think somewhere along that line, like eventually, like got into Mac, and I was like, okay, this just feels almost like Linux because you still get the terminal handy, and like it feels a lot more native that kind of experience from Linux. But then it just feels like, oh, but this is so much more polished, and like I don't have to spend all day trying to get my GUI working. So yeah,
Yeah, and you plug things into it and it just works and you're like, "What?"
exactly. Why not?
Magic, yes, I fully agree. Okay, next question. Do you have a favorite programming language?
Yeah, I think for now it's Python. Like I've spent a couple of years working with Python, so yeah,
Nice.
Python.
I'm a huge Python fan too, and for folks who have listened to the show, I came out from a Java background many years, 16 years, and then turned to Python because of a friend of mine, and I like fell in love. So yeah, I am so with you. Love Python so much.
Yeah, Python is
Cool.
such an easy language. Yeah, I love it.
It is, yeah. I don't know. I know a lot of people have like issues with the indentation. I kind of hate curly braces to be honest. I think it's cluttery. And I love the indentation. I think it's just easy to read and it's like pleasant to program.
Yeah.
Like I write Python code, I'm like, oh my god, this is the most fun ever.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely don't miss curly braces. Yeah, I do TypeScript
Yeah.
every now and then, but yeah, I love Python. It's nice and clean.
All right, go Team Python. Okay, next question. Do you prefer dev or ops?
Dev or ops? Um, I think definitely dev. uh, yeah, definitely dev. I love the
Awesome.
product engineering side of things. Yeah, ops is yeah, just not for me.
Fair
Yeah, I really
enough.
lift
Fair
my hat
enough.
off. I lift my hat to to folks who do ops. because like it's a different world over there. It's a
It
different
is. It
world
is.
in ops, and like so much Terraform, and like just the style of coding and so on, and like it calls for a completely different perspective. It's a whole paradigm shift, and respect you.
Yep, yep, yeah. I do agree. Like if you're terraforming and you're used to like procedural languages, and then you go into Terraform, you're like, what the hell? Does this thing have a mind of its own?
Yeah, yeah,
It kind of breaks your brain a little bit.
yeah.
I feel you. Okay, next question. Do you prefer JSON or YAML?
Hmm, that's a tricky one. Maybe Jason. Um,
Oh yeah, in spite of the curly braces.
Yeah, I mean, I've always felt like YAML is like a little bit too quirky, and I think over the years, like I've really come to dislike some of the weird syntaxes that they use to do things.
Fair.
So, for example, like when you have like a template section and you want to reuse it in another section, I'm like, this is not obvious at all. like somebody has to sit down and teach you that like this is exactly how this thing is done. And I mean, to be fair, like you can't do much of that. Some of the features I'm thinking about, you don't get that natively in JSON, and like
Yeah.
yeah, we probably need to figure out how you do that in JSON. But yeah, YAML, like it's kind of weird, and like it's too. I think there are different ways that you can represent different things, and like it's too much flexibility for me. Like I prefer the structure that you have like with JSON, the fact that yeah, like you can have nested objects, yeah, you can have a list of things, but not like like YAML just feels like this wild west alternative. Like I prefer a bit more structure.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, I totally get that. Okay, next one. Do you prefer spaces or tabs?
Hmm. Uh, I don't even know. Because for me, because it was funny because when you were saying the indentation in Python sometimes it bothers people. Like for me, I just think let the editor figure it out, and
Yep. Yep.
get your editor configured so you never have to think about it. So that's actually one of the things I don't think about. Like I mean, I use the tab key, but like, is it doing spaces? Is it doing tabs? I think more than likely it's doing spaces, but I don't care. Like,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
the editor is configured to just do the right things. I don't have to think about it. So I don't
Right
know.
on. Right on. Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with you. Like, configure it once and then don't think about it again.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, two more questions. Do you prefer to consume content through video or text?
Hmm. Maybe video. Sometimes I like video because it's easy to um yes, I guess sometimes I prefer video, just seeing a human, talking through, the expressions, the intonations, and, there are certain things that you pick up, just from, hearing a human, because there's so much that I think is embedded, just watching a human talk, that you don't get a lot of that tone, and, a lot of that, when you just read in text, because I feel like you have to reinvent that for yourself in many ways when you're just reading through something. Um, and I feel like video is kind of cheating because it does a lot of that for you. So you actually just get that for free. So yeah, let's pick video.
Oh, nice. I love that perspective. That's so cool. And then, final question. What is your superpower?
Oh, what's my superpower? Uh, hmm. I'd say my superpower is um, it'd have to be something to do with problem solving. Like I think I have a really unique way of looking at problems and solving problems. And like it doesn't matter how challenging it is. Like I always am able to find some interesting way of solving problem. I think that's my superpower.
I think that's so cool because I find oftentimes some people don't associate tech with creativity, right? And I honestly think tech is one of the most creative jobs. And to be able to, and we're afforded this ability to solve problems in like non-standard ways.
Hmm.
um and then, speaking to your superpower, like being able to look at problems in different ways and solve them in like different ways as well. I mean, that's what leads to like innovations and building on ideas and all that, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, which is something I really think about a lot because like I think like one of the keys to like problem solving in like really novel and interesting and innovative ways, I think it's just the ability to be able to, break down a problem that you have into like first principles, and you really start to understand, okay, like these are the elements of the problem I'm trying to solve. And then that enables you to look at a wide variety of other disciplines now where they've probably solved that problem before. And I think that's where innovation really comes in, right? Because you're able to look at this problem from a completely different angle, completely different perspective, and you're able to pull on experience and experiences of others, and look at other ways that problem has been solved, but just from first principles, and then reapplying it and putting the layers back on. Yeah, I think it's like one of the most rewarding things ever.
I agree, and I think, you hit on a really important part, which is like breaking down that problem to its essence, because I think oftentimes it can be so easy to get overwhelmed by a big problem, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh my god, this thing seems impossible. But then it's like, what do you boil it down to? What are like the main things that I have, what's the thing that I have to solve at the end of the day? And then solving that like problem, and then reconstructing it, right, as you said. And as you reconstruct it, you can find like interesting things that you had not even considered before, which I think is so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really love that idea of breaking things down because, like, I mean, one of the things I've done several times is okay, just try and break it down, go explain it to my wife, and get her perspective on how she'd solve like a simpler version of the same problem, and then you just work in reverse, right? Because once you kind of step outside of that box of, oh, it's this server, and it's a gRPC, and we're trying to connect this thing to this other thing, like it's actually not that unique.
Yeah.
Because we've solved like across the world, we've solved so many different problems, and yeah, it's just really exciting to think about. A lot of the paradigms that we have today, they're just variants of problems that we've seen before, but just masquerading with different names. It actually throws me back to university because I remember when I was doing I think it was my master's in computer science. um, I was learning about the different network types. So you remember we talked about like GPRS and so on. So I learned
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
I think how 2G networks are structured,
Yeah.
then how 3G networks are structured, and then it really started to annoy me because I realized that, hey, look, you guys have the same components, but you just give them different names. So in 2G, you have a set of components that, they do this, that, that. And then you come to 3G, it's like, okay, roughly the same set of components, but because it's 3G, we had to change the names. And then you come to 4G, and it's like, okay, different set of components, structurally they're kind of doing the same thing, but because it's 4G, we have to give them different names, right? And it's the same thing that applies like in tech, I think, and to any other discipline. Whatever problem we're trying to solve, chances are that problem it's been solved elsewhere, and we can draw a parallel if we're careful enough to just break down the problem. We can actually start to see examples of how similar problems have been solved.
Yeah, it's so so true. Like I found, a number of years ago, I was working in a company where uh they were using HashiCorp Nomad, for their
Mhm.
workload orchestrator instead of Kubernetes. And
Mhm.
I heard of it, and that was it, right? And I never used Nomad. I'd use Kubernetes. And so I'm like, I'm trying to learn Nomad. And so I'm like, okay, I'm trying to draw parallels. What's
Right.
similar, but what's different, right? And drawing on that pre-existing knowledge really helped me, like having had that base, right, really helped me understand Nomad a lot better. So, to your point, I think having something as a basis,
Yeah.
to be able to compare, I think makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I was gonna say definitely in terms of even how our brains work. Like the more like we draw kind of connections to something that's already established that we understand well, it really helps us to accelerate just our understanding, and it helps with retention as well a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even with like learning new programming languages, right? Um, even if it's, something there, I mean, there are obviously like programming languages that are similar.
Right.
Um, and then there are ones that are like similar but different, but still having like that base level of understanding. It's like, okay, well,
Hmm.
everyone has a loop.
Yep.
Everyone probably has like every language probably has like an if else. They
Yeah.
have variables. So like
Conditionals. Yep.
what can we start with? Like, we have like some common elements, and then figure out the ways in which they're different as well, which is
Yeah.
cool. I wanted to ask, because you said you ran some stuff past your wife, when you have like some of these like when you're problem solving. Is your wife also in tech?
No. She's a
Oh,
pharmacist.
cool. That's
But
awesome.
but more importantly, she's incredibly smart. So like I always run stuff by her, and she always has like really great. She's a great problem solver. So I use it as a cheat. So I just need to break down my problem. Like I get some perspective from her. Always helps.
That's so cool. And I guess the cool thing too is it forces you to break down a problem in a way that she, as a non-techie, can
Yeah.
understand, which then has the side effect of making you understand the problem better.
Hmm. Yeah, it definitely does because it really takes because that kind of rigor to be able to because I like it's one thing that comes to mind is just thinking about this whole idea this idea of if you read something like that helps, right? But then if you actually get to the point that you can actually teach someone else, like that requires this advanced level of rigor, and you really have to understand the material, and it really tests your understanding because like there's this whole saying that causal knowledge is deeply nested because it's easy to think you understand something, right? But it's as soon as you start trying to actually relay that to someone else, and you start even just explaining it to yourself, right? As soon as you start to do that, that's where you start to realize, oh shoot, how does this thing wait, why does this thing connect to that other thing? That doesn't make sense, right? And you have to keep digging, and that's the nested nature of it. And then you dig somewhere, and you're like, wait, I don't understand why this microservice actually makes that call to that service. Like, what's the purpose of that? And then you keep going, and yeah, it really forces you to understand it a lot better.
Yeah, I totally agree. I find also, nothing forces you to understand a topic better than when you're like having to give a talk about it or write about it.
Yes.
Like I find
Hmm.
whenever I blog on stuff, especially things that are new to me, it's tempting to like, and I see this in a lot of blog posts. It's tempting to get like an explanation for a concept from, quoted from another blog post. And I
Hmm.
oftentimes, these explanations are like, what? What are you saying? What does this mean in actual human terms? And so I try as much as possible to resist the temptation of just parroting it and trying to figure out a way to explain it in my own words. And I have to
Yes.
say, I give credit to my English teachers in high school
Hmm.
who always put the fear of God in us when it came to plagiarism. So always forcing us to like,
Yeah.
reword things in our own words, explain things in our
Hmm.
own words, or otherwise quote them from the source. So I always have like my high school English teachers like nagging at me, but it's a good, when you're a student, you're like, oh, why can't I
Yeah.
just copy from here? But I think it's like such a valuable exercise because it
Yeah.
really forces you to like explain something rather than just like parrot something out that you're like, I don't even know what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I mean, so I think one way that this really comes in, I'm just thinking about like LLMs and everything that's happening now. With LLMs being able to generate code and being able to generate so much text, there's this danger now. Like I often worry about the industry and like where we're going as an industry because we're losing that like that temptation that you talked about, right? Like if you can get something else to actually do the rigor and understand what's going on and then actually generate the explanation or the thing, right? Then you could feel the temptation to be just like, okay, let me just accept this, or you decrease the level of rigor that you're using to kind of vet and validate what you're actually looking at, right? And it means that we understand it less, right? And it's really like, I think it's like we end up having to build like a completely different muscle now, because now that the code generation can happen a lot faster. Now we really have to build that muscle for being able to read and quickly, really deeply, understand exactly what's going on, right? Because like a lot of time the reading of code happens like, in our mind, but it's actually a lot better when you vocalize, because like that's where a lot more of the rigor starts coming, because you're vocalizing, you're like, okay, okay, so this function calls this, wait, why does this function call this function? But if you're just kind of reading it in your mind, you're like, okay, that function called that function, and you just kind of keep going, right? And we have to find creative ways to ensure that we ensure that we get that same level of rigor, so we're understanding exactly what's being done.
Yeah, I agree with you so much on this. And I think I think it always brings back also the conversation about like where do juniors fit into all this, right? Because juniors are in so many organizations are essentially being told you must write all your code like AI assisted, right? Vibe code your code. And like I think if you're an experienced developer, first of all, you can cut through the bullshit that is vibe coded. And also you can, I think, read you can tell like a good design versus a bad design, right?
Right.
Um, and for a junior, like I almost feel like they miss out on the I'll put in air quotes the joys of troubleshooting, because like on the one hand, like troubleshooting nothing puts the fear of God in me like when my code doesn't work. But also there's a
Yeah.
certain joy to troubleshooting, right? Because like when you go from like, oh my God, I understand why it's failing. Oh my God, I have a deeper understanding of the problem. And it leads to like this deeper knowledge overall of what's going on. And so all of a sudden, like, I feel like it just expands all the neural pathways in your, like it's this exponential expansion of neural pathways in your brain where it's like, holy crap, there's like so much stuff I understand now. And I feel like as you said, it's like it's a different muscle that's being worked on when you're vibe coding. And I think as a junior it becomes so much harder because like they haven't gone necessarily in the same way of like troubleshooting. They will never experience what it's like to be on Stack Overflow in the middle of the night trying to figure out like
Yes.
why is this
Yeah.
thing not working.
Or like
It's
post it and then going back the next morning and refreshing, just hoping like, please tell me that somebody around the world has seen my question and has posted an answer.
exactly, or even stuff like the LLM spits out some code. Like it was funny. My husband was telling me he was like messing around with vibe coding the other day, the AI assistant was like even doing its own troubleshooting and stuff, and and I don't know that juniors would necessarily understand the troubleshooting process. Like they would just take that for granted that the LLM would do that. And how do they know that the troubleshooting is correct? Like he's got enough experience under his belt. He's got over 30 years of experience as a developer, as an architect of various solutions to like, yeah, okay, this makes sense. This doesn't make sense. Cool that you did this, but like, what of the juniors? Like, they'll never quite have that same experience. Um, and I think it's a really interesting philosophical question because it's like, well, there's so many things like we don't do assembly, we don't code with punch cards. Um, but like on the one hand, I will say in
Those are
university,
non-deterministic systems.
like I didn't study computer science. I studied in industrial engineering, so I don't know how a compiler works. But I will tell you, I did take a microprocessors class in university and learned and did some assembly language. And I will tell you, I had so much more of an appreciation for like memory allocation um, when I took that course where I'm like, oh, this makes sense. All of that stuff with C, with
Yeah,
malloc, which was like, oh my God, these errors are so irritating. All of that
yeah,
stuff, like, I think having that like base knowledge, like, do you have to be proficient in it? No. But to have like that base understanding to like give you that foundation,
yeah.
that was so cool and so helpful for me.
So
What's your thought?
yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts on it. So I think number one is the fact that one of the things that's changing is junior developers, well, all developers have a much more powerful weapon, right? So, like, you know, previously we had an IDE and, we had to do this whole debugging thing by ourselves. We had to generate code by ourselves and so on. But now we have this amazing LLM that can just like spit out code and so on. And, like, one of the things that comes back to me is I remember in the book Observability Engineering, they talk about this loop where you basically come up with a theory. So like you're investigating a problem in production, right? So there's this core loop that you go through. You come up with a theory, you test that theory, and then if the theory doesn't pan out, you realize, oh yeah, it's not that theory. Then you come up with another theory, right? And then you keep running that loop. No, and I think what's actually happening is that the speed at which we can do that loop is a lot faster, right? And I think what's unfair to juniors is they don't necessarily understand that loop yet, right? And they don't understand the power of that loop and like why that loop is important, right? Because I think what you talked about in terms of, really debugging things, feeling the pain of like, why is this thing not working, to like the joy and the satisfaction of yes, like finally, like, going through that joy and so on, like that's creating neural pathways. That's helping us really understand how things work. It's changing our mental model. It's expanding our mental model of how like system works and how different things work and how they're connected and so on. And with the LLM like being used as a tool, like the way I see it is that we can really accelerate that loop, right? Because like as a senior engineer, you can use an LLM to test a lot more theories, right? Because like talking about that whole idea of Stack Overflow, like that's a really protracted process, right? Where you have an error, you're like, okay, I don't know, like what's causing this error. Okay, let me go post on Stack Overflow, 30 minutes, right? All right, let me Google in the meantime and see like if there's anything I can find. Couple hours, right? And then you still don't find an answer, right? So like tomorrow you come back and you're like, okay, let me actually check Stack Overflow, see if anybody saw like what was happening. Okay, maybe let me reach out to some folks, right, in the community. Let me check other people in the company if they've seen that. Like all of these are really long feedback loops, right? But with the LLM, because it's so powerful, like it like it's trained on so much data on the web that it has so much context already. And then of course like with MCP, model context protocol, you can hook it up to other things like context 7 is one of the ones I use, so that it brings in documentation from different places, right? So that allows us to do that loop a lot faster, right? So I could say, for example, hey, like I'm wondering what's causing this problem. Like I'm thinking maybe one, two, three of these things could be wrong, right? And then I could say maybe I don't even know how to verify those things, and I could just ask like, how can I go about verifying this, right? And it tells me. So then I'm learning. Oh, that's how you. Oh, okay. So that. Okay, so that's actually a command I can run and blah blah blah, right? And so like I can cycle through like testing so many different theories like so much faster, and like I think we can really accelerate like how so many of these mental pathways and my mental understanding and my mental model for how the entire system works. I can really accelerate that pace, right? But then I think it comes with time, and I think this generation of like senior engineers, having been through the Stack Overflow days and the Google days, I think it's easier to appreciate that acceleration. But for junior engineers who are just coming, it's hard not to look at LLMs as like an authority, and it's like, oh, this thing is like so smart, and it's like, okay, and it's not like they like, to be fair to them, they don't necessarily know how to differentiate quality. They don't, they haven't written and felt the pain, and seeing things break in production, and seeing how different patterns and so on, and just that level of rigor and the level of evaluation that they can subject is really hard. And so we're asking them to learn about this loop, and to learn to accelerate to use that loop effectively using LLMs, which is really hard. And I think mentorship, I think will help a lot with that. Really helping engineers, some of these junior engineers, to really understand like these are the ways, and training and stuff. And like I'm really hoping that just in general, I've seen like Anthropic put out they had put out a AI fluency course, like a
Hmm.
mini course, and I'm sure there are lots of others. And like I'm really hoping that with a lot of these things, like the industry starts to shift, and junior engineers get the help they need.
Yeah, and now here's a question for you, because the I thought of this because of something that my daughter has experienced in her high school. So she said, because of AI, everything, um, when she started high school, even middle school, like she would bring her laptop into class, but because because of teachers being afraid of kids plagiarizing using AI,
Mhm.
relying too much on AI, they're actually having to go back to like first principles and handwrite a lot of stuff, which is quite interesting. It's kind of
Yeah.
hilarious, and I feel like on the one hand, I'm like, oh, this is pretty neat. On the other hand, I feel like can't we just find a middle ground? Because like why can't they also teach the students to leverage AI? Like, my thought process around all this in general is like I'm not saying junior developers should never use AI. Um, I'm My thought is, wouldn't it be interesting if we required, rather than having our junior developers using AI from the start, why don't we require them to actually do things without AI assistance, and then gradually introduce that so that they have that flavor for what problem solving can be. That's one way I think to approach it. And I guess the other way is, maybe we give into it in the sense that we we have to maybe retrain ourselves how to code in the age of AI, and maybe so then providing, maybe not saying, hey, you must code the olden days way of like 20-25 years ago, but maybe like maybe have an emphasis of like what does proper, it's like what you were saying with that course on AI fluency. Let's teach proper AI fluency so that our juniors aren't basically like left going, well, left producing crap. Essentially, we don't want that, right?
So I have a couple of thoughts about that. So I think primarily one of the things that I think as folks that are on the frontier of seeing what LLMs can accomplish today, I think one of the things we have to be very careful of is we don't want to be stuck being those old people who said, you know, don't use calculators, only use pen and paper, right? Only work things out the old way, right? Because the truth of the matter is, this is a new level of abstraction. Like whether we like it or not, like this is a new level of abstraction. And I think one of the things that is fundamentally different is that the fact that this is a non-deterministic um, abstraction, which is I think very different from what we've seen in the past, right? And
Yes.
when I say in terms of non-deterministics for folks who are not familiar, it's just this idea that if you give one input, you always expect the same output, right? So the calculator is a great example. If you do 2 plus 4, you always expect to get 6, right? You always expect to get that output. But with the LLM, you put in the same input 10 times, you're getting 10 different results, right? So I think that's one thing. I think we have to accept the fact that okay, this is a new level of abstraction, right? So we're not using pen and paper anymore. This is a calculator, and this is a really powerful calculator. So I think we have to figure out what are the right set of guardrails that we put in place, so that people can learn how to use this thing effectively, right? Because I'm pretty sure that, like, if we go back and look at, like, again, the introduction of the calculator, I'm sure people had like lots of similar concerns that, okay, oh, we're afraid that people aren't going to learn how to use math properly. People are not going to learn math principles. And I'm sure there are some professors that, probably had heart attacks because, they're like, oh my, like, this is the worst thing that could ever have happened, right? And like I said, we don't want to stop being those people, right? What we really want to do is we really want to understand, okay, like, this is something that's really powerful, but we need to think about guardrails. So I go back to your example about, like, whether, like, do we need to basically say to juniors, for example, okay, no, you need to code without an LLM. So I think that's one strategy of putting some of those guardrails in place, because I think inherent in what it sounds like the goal is there is that we want them to learn how to use this thing effectively, right? And I think, that's one possible strategy, right? So we could say, okay, just don't use it at all, right? And I think the strategy has to vary based on the environment and based on the processes that we have in place, right? So, but like, some of the things I'm thinking about, and like, I don't have all the solutions to this, but like, I'm thinking some of the ideas that comes to me, I think about, like, Cursor has like a dot rules thing now, right? Where you can say and specify like how you want it to behave, and you use like a rules file to confine, just how confine some of the flexibility of the LLM, right? And you teach it structure, and you have things like agent skills where you can teach it different skills and so on. And I think within some of that framework, where we're able to basically describe to the LLM and put guardrails around the LLM, I think that's where we start to encode some of the practices and the processes that really help to inspire that growth from junior engineers, right? So, like, one of the things that comes to mind is I think about, I've used LLMs for like system design interview practice, for example. So, if I want to do a system design problem, and I've seen, lots of folks do this, right? Where basically what you say is you say, okay, walk me through this, don't give me the answers, let's do a turn by turn. And that way what you're doing is you're really constraining it, and you're really helping to put those guardrails in place so that you ensure that it is used the way that you want it to be used. And I think if it and I think, the responsibility really falls to especially those who've had the experience and understand, that experience of like the core debugging loop, and really understanding the benefits of really understanding exactly what we're doing. Like, we have to take that experience and we have to say, okay, how do we help folks to get the benefit of that experience with a more powerful tool, right? And which is part of the hard part, because now we have to minus the slow tools that we had, 5-10 years ago, and then we have to reimagine, okay, how could we have done what we did before with a more powerful set of tools but just much faster, and like, what guardrails do we put in place so that we preserve those foundational elements that really help people excel.
I really like that. And so by having some of those guardrails in place, like even like your instructions files that describe exactly how things are to be done, it also forces your junior engineer to look at those. And I guess it has two effects, right? One is like, oh, now I know what a good instruction file looks like. Secondly, you've basically codified best practices in a file in markdown format, which is extremely valuable. Which is it's funny because I think back to the when I started my career, 25 it'll be 25 years this year, 25 years ago. There's all sorts of like style guides, right? Coding style guides, but really
Exactly,
it was,
yeah. I remember
there's
those.
one, right? And it was a doc,
CSS
but like,
style guides, HTML style guides.
right, right. But like, you still have to rely on people to follow them. And
Yeah.
now you're saying like we have a means of finally enforcing this. forcing our will, our coding will upon people, if you will.
Which is actually a really interesting example, because if you think about the evolution of even style guides, now we have design systems, right? And like so many people have design systems, and what actually happened there is, so in the older days when you had a style guide, like you had to, like I said, rely on people to follow it, and then you had to have some kind of gatekeeping somewhere. Hopefully that was actually a linter and not like a human having to, prod people. Hey, you didn't use this prefix in this class name, right? But then how that evolved is we stopped arguing with people, right? And we actually just encoded it into a design system. And it's like some of these rules are just deeply encoded, and you don't have a choice. Like you don't have a choice anymore, right? And like some of those elements are just completely removed. And what we're left with is like some syntax that folks can use. And like hopefully, we're preserving the elements that we actually want people to learn, right?
Yeah, yeah, you're basically saving people from themselves. I mean, yeah, and that's why I love what you said about guardrails, because in you know there's the creative side of tech, which I think is something we all appreciate, but then there's the let's please follow some bloody standards so that it doesn't look like a fucking mess, and we all like understand each other's code, because there's nothing that drove me crazier, especially in my Java days, reading someone else's code and and then like I'm used to formatting my code a certain way, and
Right.
then other people are used to formatting their code a slightly different way, and I had to stop myself from like going in and reformatting their code my way, which is horrible. Like, I resisted temptation, but there's that, right? And fortunately, modern tooling, um, in the form of AI assistants and instruction files in particular, can help prevent this from happening, because now we're all following the same style, and you just got to do that, which is
Yeah.
awesome. I see that as a huge plus.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, even with LLMs, like I thought that was also like a really cool idea. This whole idea of LLM linters, I think brings us to like a next level of what we can do, because with linters you had like a lot of linters are static types. So basically they take your code and they build out what is called like an abstract syntax tree. So they're basically just breaking your code into a tree, and then it traverses the tree trying to figure out if the code is structured a certain way. And like largely, and you have some simpler linters that don't need to like build a whole tree, but there still were lots of limitations in terms of what we could enforce, right? But with LLMs, it brings us to like a whole new generation of different kinds of things that we can enforce, right? And I think again, using those guardrails and starting to throw, because it's so much better to let somebody argue with a robot about certain things that we've already decided. Like if we've decided on two white spaces, no, that doesn't need to be human to human conversation. You go argue with your linter after we've like already said to the linter, hey, it's two spaces, right? And it's the same thing. I think we can leverage some of those examples to enforce some higher level paradigms as well. So it's not just uh, like PyTorch. Sorry, not PyTorch. Like PyLint is like what we use in the Python community a lot, and
Yeah.
you can really start to enforce, some ideas that are much more nuanced. So maybe you want to talk about your architecture layer and like how, some of these higher level concepts like coupling, like we don't want, different things to be too coupled in terms of how components work. And, you can use those as teaching points, right? Because no, that's nowhere we talk about this whole idea of trying to embed some of the knowledge and, all of that into the system and into the guardrails, so that as folks who are not as familiar with these patterns and why they're important, we can use those as teaching moments.
Yes, I love that so much. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that all of a sudden it opens up this whole world of possibilities, and it goes from like, LLMs can result in like bad habits to like, no, let's use the LLM for good,
Yeah.
and to like structure your project properly. When it generates code for you, now it's following a particular coding style guide, so there is no there is no question.
Yeah.
Or like even, yeah, I mean, as you said, like decoupling stuff like API design, like
Yep.
that all, but also I think providing, as you said, the mentoring
Yeah.
to your developers so that it's like, do you understand why this is happening this way? You know, like so that they know where it's coming from rather than like, oh, magic, right? Like that's the way it is for all projects. That someone provide like there's this magical like instructions file that has all the things that I need so that when they go to their next job or next team or whatever, they're armed with that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it's you touched on it there. I'm glad you brought back the point of mentoring because I think it's so important. I can think of so many critical things that I learned from other senior engineers as I was growing as well. Things that stuck with me, like just like how to debug, and I've had the privilege of also sharing my workflow with lots of other folks, and it's been incredibly helpful for them. Somebody will come and say, "Hey, Jean-Marc, can I just shadow you and see how you debug this problem?" And I get to show them my process and like how I'm thinking and how I'm going through step by step. And I think it's going to be so important again because we have to blend the best of both worlds. Like uh, engineers of this generation, we understand the pain of having protracted feedback loops and having tools that like are just so slow. And like we have in our hands now a tool that helps us to really accelerate that feedback loop. But then we have an AI native generation that, they're much more familiar, at least some of them are much more familiar with AI and they're growing up on this, they're using it a lot more and in many ways they have a higher fluency than we do. So it's really how do we blend the best of the both worlds to ensure that we inspire growth and we're also growing as senior engineers.
Yeah, I love that. That is just a perfect way to wrap things up. We are coming up on time, so before we go, though, I wanted to ask you if you had any parting words of wisdom for our audience, whether it's related to vibe coding or career or anything that kind of tickles your fancy.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about AI, I guess that's top of mind for me now. I think let's learn to use it. Let's learn to use it. Let's all figure this out together. Let's share as we're learning. Let's share with each other and let's see how whatever patterns we're seeing that are successful. Let's share those. Whatever patterns we're seeing that are not successful, let's also share those. I've really loved some of the feedback I'm seeing from like Honeycomb. Like Honeycomb is really great at being public about lessons that they've learned and things that went well, things that don't go well. Let's not be worried too much. Like we've we've weathered different different times where new abstractions have come in and we've had to really adjust. So I think we'll be okay.
Oh, I love that. That's such a great way to leave this off. Well, thank you so much, Jean-Marc, for geeking out with me today. And y'all don't forget to subscribe and be sure to check the show notes for additional resources and to connect with us and our guests on social media. Until next time,
Peace out and geek out.
Geeking Out is hosted and produced by me, Adriana Vilela. I also compose and perform the theme music on my trusty clarinet. Geeking Out is also produced by my daughter, Hannah Maxwell, who incidentally designed all of the cool graphics. Be sure to follow us on all the socials by going to bio.site/geekingout.